Dean Martin was halfway through Ain't That a Kick in the Head when Eddie Marsh appeared in the wings with a face the color of cigarette ash. It was 2:47 p.m. on November 22nd, 1963, and something had gone terribly wrong with the world. But the audience in the copper room at the Sands Hotel didn't know that yet. They were laughing, drinking, swaying to the music. And Dean Martin, the king of cool, was trapped on stage with a secret that would turn the next 90 minutes into the longest performance of his life. Eddie didn't wave. He didn't signal. He just stood there in the shadows, motionless, his hands hanging at his sides like dead weight. Dean saw him between verses. Their eyes met for half a second. Eddie's lips moved, forming words Dean couldn't hear over the band. But he didn't need to hear them. He'd known Eddie Marsh for 12 years. Eddie didn't panic. Eddie didn't interrupt shows. Eddie was the steadiest man Dean had ever worked with. And right now, Eddie looked like he'd seen the end of the world. Dean's voice didn't falter. His timing didn't slip. He finished the song, accepted the applause, smiled that lazy smile that made it look like everything came easy. But his mind was already somewhere else, calculating, measuring, trying to understand what could make Eddie Marsh look like that. "Thank you, folks. You're too kind." Dean set the microphone back on the stand. "We're going to take a short break. Don't go anywhere. I've got a few more songs that'll either make you fall in love or fall asleep, and honestly, I'm good with either one." The audience laughed. Dean walked off stage with that same unhurried grace, hands in his pockets, like he had all the time in the world. But the moment the curtain closed behind him, his face changed. The mask dropped. What happened? Eddie couldn't speak. He just handed Dean a piece of paper, a telegram. Dean read it once. Then again. The words didn't make sense. They were too big, too impossible. President Kennedy shot in Dallas, condition critical. Stand by for updates. Dean looked up. When? 20 minutes ago, maybe less. Eddie's voice was barely a whisper. "Parkland Hospital. They're saying it's bad, Dean. Really bad. Who knows? Frank got the call first. He's in his suite. Sammy's with him. They sent me to tell you." Dean folded the telegram and put it in his pocket. His hands were steady. They were always steady. The audience? Nobody knows yet. News is just breaking on the radio. TV's going crazy. But in there, Eddie gestured toward the showroom. They don't know anything. Dean was quiet for a long moment. Through the curtain, he could hear the murmur of 2,000 people talking, laughing, ordering drinks. 2,000 people living in a world that no longer existed. How long until they find out? Eddie shrugged helplessly. Minutes, maybe less. Someone's going to have a radio. Someone's going to get a phone call. Then we have to tell them. Dean, we have to tell them, Eddie. We can't let them find out from some bartender's transistor radio. Eddie's face went even paler. You want to go back out there and tell 2,000 people that the president's been shot? Dean didn't answer. He was already walking toward the stage manager's booth. Eddie followed, stumbling slightly, still in shock. The stage manager, a compact man named Lou Grayson, was listening to a small radio, his face frozen in disbelief. When he saw Dean, he turned the volume down but didn't turn it off. The announcer's voice continued in the background, urgent and mechanical. "Lou, I need you to hold the curtain." Lou looked up. "You heard? I heard. How long can you give me?" "Dean, I don't think—" "How long?" Lou glanced at his watch. "Show's supposed to run another hour and 20, but if word gets out, if people start leaving, they won't leave. Not if I'm on stage." It wasn't arrogance, it was calculation. Dean Martin understood crowds. He understood how people behaved when their world was collapsing. They needed something to hold on to. They needed someone to tell them it was going to be all right, even if it wasn't. Eddie grabbed his arm. "Dean, you can't go back out there and pretend nothing's wrong." "I'm not going to pretend. I'm going to do my job." "Your job is to make people laugh. How are you supposed to do that when the president might be dying?" Dean pulled his arm free, gently but firmly. "My job is to give people 90 minutes where they don't have to think about the fact that the president might be dying. That's exactly what I'm going to do." He turned and walked back toward the stage. Eddie and Lou exchanged a glance. Neither of them moved to stop him. What could they say? Dean Martin had made up his mind. The band was playing film music when Dean stepped back through the curtain. The audience applauded automatically, a Pavlovian response to his presence. Dean took the microphone and waited for the noise to settle. "Folks, I need to share something with you before we continue." The room went quiet, 2,000 people leaning forward slightly, sensing the shift in his tone. Dean's voice was calm, measured, empty of inflection. "About 20 minutes ago, President Kennedy was shot in Dallas, Texas. He's been taken to a hospital. We don't know his condition yet. That's all the information we have right now." For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Then the room erupted. Gasps, screams. A woman in the front row covered her mouth with both hands. A man stood up so fast his chair fell backward. Voices overlapped, frantic, demanding more information that Dean didn't have. He waited, didn't raise his voice, didn't try to talk over them, just stood there with the microphone, patient, letting the wave crest and break. Finally, the noise began to subside. People were crying. Others were frozen in their seats, staring at nothing. A few were already standing, looking for the exits. "I know what you're feeling right now," Dean said quietly. "I'm feeling it too. You can leave if you need to. Nobody's going to stop you. But if you stay, I promise you this, for the next 90 minutes, I'm going to do everything I can to give you a reason not to think about what's happening out there. Because sometimes the only thing we can do when the world goes crazy is hold on to something normal. And right now, normal is me, this band and these songs." He nodded to the conductor. "Hit it." The band started playing "Everybody Loves Somebody." Dean sang. His voice was steady. The melody was familiar. And slowly, impossibly, people began to settle back into their seats. But Dean could see it in their faces. They weren't really listening. They were waiting for someone to run in with news, waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for the world to confirm what they already suspected in their bones. Dean sang 3 more songs. Between each one, he told jokes. Not his best material. Not the sharp, perfectly timed zingers that usually killed. Just simple, warm, human jokes, the kind you'd tell at a family dinner. The audience barely laughed, but they stayed. That was what mattered. At 3:15 p.m., Eddie appeared in the wings again. This time, he didn't need to say anything. Dean could read it in the slump of his shoulders, the way he couldn't quite meet Dean's eyes. Dean finished, "That's a more," and set the microphone down. He walked to the edge of the stage and sat down, legs dangling over the side, like he was just having a conversation with friends. "Folks, I just got word." His voice cracked, just slightly, just enough. "President Kennedy died about 10 minutes ago." This time, the room didn't erupt. It collapsed inward. Silence so complete, Dean could hear someone sobbing in the back row, could hear the ice settling in glasses at the bar, could hear his own heartbeat. He didn't stand up, didn't try to move past the moment, just sat there, one hand resting on his knee, the other holding the microphone loosely. "I don't have words for this. I don't think anybody does. We just lost a good man, a young man, a man with a family." Dean paused. "I met him once, 3 years ago, right before the inauguration. He came to see the show in D.C., shook my hand afterward, told me he was a fan. I told him I voted for him. A ghost of a smile. He said he appreciated it, but he probably would have won anyway." A few people laughed. It was a sad, broken sound, but it was something. "So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to finish this show, not because I want to, not because I think songs matter right now, but because somewhere in Washington, Jackie Kennedy is living through the worst day of her life. And somewhere in this country, there are people who need to remember that even when the world breaks, we don't have to break with it." He stood up, nodded to the band. They started playing "The Way You Look Tonight." Dean sang, and this time, he wasn't performing, he was surviving. Every note was an act of will. Every verse was a refusal to let the darkness win. The audience stayed, all of them, not because they wanted to hear music, but because Dean Martin was standing on that stage, holding the line, refusing to let go. And if he could do that, maybe they could too. By 4:30 p.m., the show was supposed to be over. Dean had done 90 minutes. He'd delivered every song on the set list. But when he finished the last number, nobody moved. They just sat there, looking at him, waiting. So he kept going. He sang songs that weren't on the program. Old standards he hadn't performed in years. Sinatra songs, Crosby songs, songs his mother used to sing when he was a boy in Steubenville, Ohio. He sang until his voice started to fray at the edges, sang until the band was exhausted, sang until the sun went down and the casino lights came on outside and the world kept turning despite everything. At 6 p.m., 3.5 hours after he'd first walked on stage, Dean Martin finally stopped. He didn't announce it, didn't thank the audience, just set the microphone down, nodded once and walked off. Backstage, Eddie was waiting with a scotch. Dean took it but didn't drink, just held the glass, feeling its weight, its coldness. "They're calling it the performance of your life," Eddie said quietly. Dean shook his head. It wasn't a performance. Frank Sinatra appeared in the doorway. His eyes were red. He'd been crying, which was something Dean had never seen before. Frank crossed the room and pulled Dean into a hug. Tight, desperate. "You did good, Pally," Frank whispered. "You did real good." Dean didn't respond. What could he say? That he'd stood on stage while the president died? That he'd sung love songs while Air Force One carried a widow and a casket back to Washington? That he'd made 2,000 people laugh when the world deserved to weep? He pulled away from Frank and walked to his dressing room, closed the door, sat down in front of the mirror and looked at himself. Same face, same expensive suit, same carefully combed hair. But something had changed. Something had broken that couldn't be fixed. For 15 years, Dean Martin had built a career on making everything look easy. The singing, the comedy, the movies, the charm. All of it effortless, all of it light. But tonight, he'd learned something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Sometimes the show goes on not because it should, but because there's nothing else to do. Sometimes you sing not because you want to, but because people need you to. And sometimes the hardest thing in the world is to stand in front of 2,000 people and pretend that pretending matters. Dean poured the scotch into the sink. He took off his tuxedo jacket and hung it carefully. He loosened his tie, and then he sat there in the silence, alone, waiting for a grief that wouldn't come because he couldn't afford to let it. The world had changed on November 22nd, 1963, but Dean Martin had kept singing. He'd held the line. He'd given 2,000 people 90 minutes of something that felt like normalcy, and he would never forgive himself for it. In the years that followed, Dean rarely spoke about that day. When interviewers asked, he'd deflect with a joke or change the subject. But people who knew him said he was never quite the same after Dallas. The lightness dimmed. The ease became effort. Sammy Davis Jr. once asked him, years later, why he'd kept singing that day. Why he hadn't just cancelled the show and let people grieve. Dean was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Because if I'd stopped, I would have had to feel it, and I wasn't ready to feel it." "Are you ready now?" Sammy asked. Dean smiled. That same lazy, practiced smile that never quite reached his eyes anymore. "Ask me tomorrow." But tomorrow never came. Not the one where Dean Martin could put down the weight of that day and walk away. He carried it with him through every performance, every recording session, every late night at the bar. Carried it until December 25th, 1995, when his heart finally stopped and the show at last was over. The night Kennedy died, Dean Martin proved he was the consummate professional. He gave the performance of his lifetime when the world needed it most. But the cost was something nobody saw. A piece of himself left on that stage, singing love songs while history bled out in a Dallas hospital. That's the story they don't tell. Not the hero who kept the show going, but the man who never recovered from doing it.